So towards the end, it seemed like we might actually have an outcome, up until the morning of Friday, where many diplomats thought, well, we somehow managed it. It did come as a surprise around early afternoon that no, it looks like we are not going to have an outcome, that Russia does have an objection after all.
That's the voice of Gaukhar Mukhatzhanova, the director of the International Organization to Non-Proliferation program at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plasters Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts Tom Collina and Lauren Billet.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Hi, Tom. Good morning. How was your weekend?
Lauren, how are you? I had a great weekend. It was very quiet compared to my previous weekend. I just kind of puttered around the house and did things. It was very nice. How was yours?
Mine was pretty much the same. There was a highlight, though. I did get to see my 7-year-old cousin cheer her first football game. I will never get over how seriously people take football, and I don't like the heat, but I'll suffer through it for my family. Not as exciting news as what's going on the nuclear front, Tom, so I'll kick it over to you to update us.
Well, thanks for that. On the Iran nuclear deal, which is the deal that never ceases to keep on giving, despite recent progress, we are still waiting for an agreement. Last week, the Biden administration sent a response to Iran's latest proposal, and we are still waiting for Iran's reply. Of the issues that have been holding up progress, it appears now that Iran has agreed to put off until later talking about U.S. sanctions on Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Iran wants those sanctions removed, and has also put off discussions of the International Nuclear Safeguards investigation, and Iran wants that closed. But still unresolved is the question of how Iran can protect sanctions relief under the deal if a future U.S. president were to withdraw, as President Trump did in 2018. And of course, diplomacy remains the best way to stop Iran's nuclear program, and we will keep you up to date as the negotiations continue. At the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in New York, the event ended in disarray on Friday as Russia blocked consensus on the final document of the month-long conference. Even though the final document had been significantly weakened throughout the negotiations, Russia refused to accept it because of references to the war in Ukraine, and the conference ended without agreement. It is troubling that the Ukraine crisis is now spilling out all over everything, including nuclear arms control. As we know, New START talks are on hold, and now the NPT's problems are both linked to Ukraine. Stay tuned for more on this important story later in this episode. And finally, as listeners know, there has been widespread concern about Russia's attacks on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine and the possibility of a nuclear disaster at the plant. In a sign of progress and good news, the UN Nuclear Watchdog Agency has announced it is on its way to Ukraine to protect the safety and security of Europe's biggest nuclear facility, and we wish them luck. And Lauren, what do you have queued up for us on early warning?
This week for Early Warning, I spoke with Dr. Alan Robock. We discussed a new study, which he co-led with Dr. Lili Xia, on a very important consequence of nuclear war, which is global food insecurity and famine. One of the reasons I'm excited about this interview, aside from the science itself, which is very enlightening, is that it continues a conversation that my colleague Angela Kellett had with Dr. Cheryl Harrison, who is a co-author of this famine paper last month about a study that she led on the impact of nuclear war on the Earth's oceans. I am proud that we're able to share such important scientific findings on the show, and the papers are open source, so they're free and available for anybody to read.
And then I sit down with Gaukhar Mukhatzhanova at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. We discuss the disappointing conclusion at the NPT Review Conference and what it means for the future of arms control. It's a great conversation, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
A new study from a group of international scientists led by Dr. Lili Xia and Dr. Alan Robock from Rutgers University warns us that there is no such thing as a, quote, limited nuclear war. According to the study, a limited nuclear conflict between any two nuclear-armed states could lead to mass starvation and death of 2.5 billion people if it uses even less than 3% of the global nuclear weapons supply. The immediate impact on the human population would be catastrophic, but so would the impact on life after the war, as humans would experience global food insecurity and famine from reduced crop, marine fishery, and livestock production due to climate disruption from nuclear war soot injection. Today, we're joined by study co-lead Dr. Alan Robock. Dr. Robock, I had the pleasure of attending the Emergency Food Resilience Symposium at Penn State earlier this month, where you and your team presented this study. I was invited by Dr. Cheryl Harrison of LSU, who we had on the show not too long ago, and who is also a co-author of this report. So it's my honor to welcome you to Press the Button. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So, Dr. Robock, can you please explain the key findings of this study?
A nuclear war would target cities and industrial areas, which would burn, and that would produce smoke, which would be lofted into the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, which is the layer above where we live. There's no rain there to wash the smoke out, and it would be heated by the sun, lofted up higher, and spread around the world and last for years. So we calculated what the climate impacts of that smoke would be, and then how would it affect our food supply. We looked at different scenarios of war between, say, India and Pakistan, or between the US and Russia, and we had a range of from 5 to 150 million tons of smoke. It doesn't really matter how the smoke gets up there. There are 9 nuclear nations, and any of them could have a war between themselves. And so we just wanted to use these as examples of how smoke might get in the atmosphere, and then we calculated how it would affect the food supply.
Thank you. And so, as you mentioned, war could exist between India and Pakistan, or US and Russia. So, as we all know, nuclear tensions remain high due to Russia's war in Ukraine. So, how would a limited nuclear war between the US and Russia affect food supply in the long term?
We all know the horrific direct effects of blast, radioactivity, and fire, but the impacts far removed would be more than 10 times as many people could die from the impacts on food. Now, you talked about a limited nuclear war. Anytime nuclear weapons are used, there's nothing to prevent an escalation. There have been many war games planned where retired generals sit in a room, and what would happen if one nuclear weapon was used on the battlefield against you? Would you just stop in horror, or would you use one against them to maybe stop them, and then it would go on from there? And so in almost all cases, it ends up with the entire arsenals being used. So any nuclear weapons use could be a global tragedy. It's hard to imagine a nuclear war between the US and NATO and Russia that would stop after a few weapons are being used.
Thank you for that, Dr. Robock. I completely agree. The risk of escalation is always there with any use of nuclear weapons. So can you explain to us in a bit more detail about how the food supply would be affected, and if there's any specific regions in the world that would be more affected than others?
The amount of food stored on the average in the world is about a 60-day supply. So we assume that after a nuclear war, that would be used up, and then people would have to depend on what they could grow. We looked at the major food crops: corn, wheat, rice, and soybeans. We looked at grass, which is pasture for ruminant animals, cows and sheep. We looked at fishing, which I guess Cheryl talked to you about previously. And we calculated for each country, using Food and Agriculture Organization data, what their diets are, what they grow in each country. And we assumed that importing and exporting would stop, that world food trade would stop, because people would hoard what they have, just like we used to hoard toilet paper. And so we looked at a period after the current food stocks are used up, and we calculated at the end of that year how much food there would be in each country. We divided that by the minimum amount needed to keep people alive and calculate how many people would be alive at the end of that time. And then we said, well, let's make this sort of very simplistic, draconian assumption that if people are going to die anyway, they don't get any food, and it's reserved for the people that will be alive. And we calculated how many people would be alive at the end of that. And so we looked at, and this would last for years because the climate impact would last for 5 years or more. And a war between India and Pakistan could result in the deaths of more than 2 billion people, and a war between the US and Russia could result in the deaths of more than 5 billion people. And this was using data from 10 years ago when the global population was 6.7 billion. So it's a huge fraction of the people in the world. We looked and we produced maps of what it would be like in each country. There are a couple countries in the Southern Hemisphere that would have enough food, Australia and Argentina. And in those cases, they're big food exporters now, and their population isn't that large. And so they might, and in the Southern Hemisphere, there's a big ocean, and so the climate change is not as large as in the center of continents in the Northern Hemisphere, where the land gets very cold. And so that in that case, they would have enough. On the other hand, there are a few factors we didn't consider. We didn't consider ultraviolet radiation, which would increase because ozone would be destroyed in the stratosphere. We didn't consider availability of fertilizer or fuel for machinery or agricultural know-how or seeds if you wanted to try and adapt and grow something else in a colder climate. We also didn't account for flotillas of hungry people arriving on the shores of Argentina and Australia from places where there aren't enough food. If you think environmental refugees are a problem today, just wait till then. So the summary is nuclear war would be horrible for the whole world, and the only way to prevent it is to get rid of the nuclear weapons, because if they exist, they can be used.
Very powerful, Dr. Robock. Thank you so much for your work and for the work of your partners, and thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for your interest.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Plowshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Plowshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
While many people were on vacation in August, diplomats and disarmament advocates were hard at work at the United Nations in New York. They were attending the month-long 10th Review Conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, otherwise known as the NPT. As our listeners know, the NPT has been in force for 50 years and is a central part of global efforts to stop the spread of nuclear weapons and to reduce nuclear arsenals. The treaty embodies a basic bargain. Those nations without nuclear weapons agree to never produce them, and those states with nuclear weapons agree to eventually eliminate them. But notably, there is no time frame for nuclear disarmament. The NPT is reviewed every 5 years at a major international conference with the goal of producing a consensus document with agreed ways to improve the treaty. But getting consensus among 190 nations is not easy. Some years the conference has failed to reach agreement, and this year there was no consensus. On the final day, in the final hours, Russia objected to the joint document, presumably over language about the crisis at Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The Russian delegate cast his lone protest vote and walked out of the meeting. Here with us today to explain what happened is Gaukhar Mukhatzhanova, the director of the International Organizations Program at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. Gaukhar, great to have you here.
Hello, Tom. Thanks for having me.
So, Gaukhar, let's start with the end. Russia objected to the final document and walked out. Did you and other participants at the conference expect this? And if so, why was the offending language about Ukraine left in the document?
Even before the conference started, I think the mood among many observers was that it's doomed for a variety of reasons, but the final nail being the war that Russia started against Ukraine, and seemed practically impossible that Western states, in particular in Russia, would bridge differences and how to reflect the situation and the fact that Russia issued nuclear threats and occupied nuclear facilities and attacked nuclear facilities in Ukraine, how do you adopt a document that does not adequately reflect that? And how do you reflect it adequately while having Russia on board? That was going to be a problem from the get-go. That said, it got surprisingly close. And so as the conference proceeded, the temperature, so to say, in the room was pretty low. It wasn't full of fiery debates until basically the last days of the review conference. So towards the end, it seemed like we might actually have an outcome up until the morning of Friday, where many diplomats thought, well, we somehow managed it. It did come as a surprise around early afternoon that no, it looks like we are not going to have an outcome, that Russia does have an objection after all. Russia did say in the day before the end on Thursday that they have problems with a number of paragraphs in the text. So it seemed like they would come to the president and the other parties with proposed amendments, and then there would be some late night negotiations as things usually go. So when I saw the final text without changes to the paragraphs that were going to be a problem for Russia, I thought it's going to be one of two things. Either there is no agreement, so there was no point in changing the document, or somehow they agreed to accept the language as it is. As it turns out, Russia simply did not provide the amendments to the president until late in the game on Friday. Why they did that is sort of a different question, whether it's someone dropped the ball somewhere or they just never intended to have negotiations on that language.
Do you think, in your view, if Russia had forced or said, no, we're not going to change this language, and then the conference leadership had offered to take it out, do you think the other participants to the conference would have accepted a final document without the language that Russia was opposed to?
I don't think the document would have been acceptable without those paragraphs entirely. The European states made it very clear that they have to somehow reflect what's going on. And interestingly, Ukraine also said that they wouldn't be able to accept the document without references to Russia. And my understanding is that in the end, they agreed to accept the document without direct pointing at Russia as the reason for the loss of control over Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. But the text makes it clear, right, that the Ukraine doesn't have control over the plant and that such control should be restored. Taking that out in its entirety on the last day of the review conference, I don't think that would have worked. And that's the problem. If Russia had come the day before and asked to take it out altogether, the president would have had to contact the other parties, and then they would have had to try to negotiate that. And that, my understanding is, that did not happen on Thursday evening.
Now, Russia's war in Ukraine and the ongoing nuclear crisis at Zaporizhzhia, were these major issues throughout the conference? And what were states hoping to achieve on these issues?
The war in Ukraine and its implications were one of the major issues and sort of the backdrop to overshadowing the debate. But there were many other things on the table and many other specific points around which the delegates debated. As usual, major issue at any review conference is the progress or lack thereof on nuclear disarmament, implementation of Article 6, and the number of agreements that states adopted in the past. So in 1995, we had principles and objectives for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. In 2000, we had 13 practical steps. In 2010, we had the action plan. So a major issue for this review conference was the status of implementation of all these agreements, and particularly steps on disarmament, and how do we reflect the lack of implementation, and how do we take those commitments forward? How do we prevent the further slide back? So that, I think, was the central to the entirety of the debate. And then within the nuclear disarmament, there were points of disagreement about the relative weight afforded to nuclear risk reduction measures versus the rest of the disarmament agenda. China in particular had objections to any mention of a moratorium on the production of fissile material for nuclear weapons. The non-aligned movement states in particular were pressing for more language on negative security assurances. And then within that, of course, there was also the attempt to reflect the violation of the Budapest Memorandum by Russia and the importance of upholding negative security assurances that were already given. Elsewhere, there was a bit of a debate around the status of additional protocol, whether or not it should be considered part of the verification standard. That was worked out by the most concerned parties. The Middle East is a wild card usually. And this time it was all kind of happening in the shadows again, but basically Egypt and the United States worked out the language on the Middle East well in advance. So that wasn't as much of an issue as one would have expected, or as it was at previous review conferences. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Ukraine and how to reflect the war and how to reflect the fact that a depository state has violated negative security assurances, that it has occupied civilian nuclear facilities, that it has attacked a number of civilian nuclear facilities. That was a problem for Main Committee 3 in particular, that deals with peaceful uses, and in part in Main Committee 2 as well.
Now, you mentioned that past conferences had approved documents with action plans on disarmament and non-proliferation. And now, of course, due to Russia's objection, the conference in this case was unable to agree on a final document. So how big a deal was this? What was lost in that draft document? Was there an action plan that this conference was proposing?
If you listen to the statements at the end of the review conference, and if you could feel the mood before the closing plenary, you'd see that most countries weren't happy with the document, not to the extent that they were going to single-handedly block it, and not even groups. There was some rumor about, would the non-aligned movement block, because it's a very weak language on disarmament from their perspective. They weren't ready to block, but states weren't particularly happy with what they were getting in the end. At the same time, there was understanding that the situation really demanded that we kind of rise to it and have a final document. What was lost is commitment by the United States and Russia to pursue negotiations on a follow-on treaty to a new start. Several nuclear risk reduction measures that were framed in the context of concern about the humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. And that was kind of a compromise between those who were very keen to get nuclear risk reduction measures and those who were concerned that would basically become a substitute for disarmament measures. Framing it as coming out of our concern about the possibility of use of nuclear weapons and the consequences that would have, I think that really was a good compromise, good way forward. There were several paragraphs dealing with humanitarian consequences. I think that was good to have. That was important to reflect the growing importance of this conversation and the fact that we have had several conferences with fact-based discussions about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons use and nuclear weapons testing. It's unfortunate that also got lost. And then I think the major progress was made in the Pillar 3 on peaceful uses of the atom. That one was a really good part of the document with several new measures and commitments.
As you said, there wasn't a huge amount of enthusiasm for the document among the states at the very end of the process. So given that Russia objected and the document was lost, how important would have been the things that did not ultimately get approved?
Well, we don't have now consensus commitment for the follow-on negotiations to New START. That said, it's not a given that it would have happened, right? We've had a number of action plans in the past, and the continuous trend and continuous theme through the review conferences is the lack of implementation of those past commitments. So it's hard to say what truly would have happened and what wouldn't have. There's a whole load of reaffirmations of past commitments and calls on parties to implement, calls on parties to uphold, and calls on the Conference on Disarmament to finally start negotiating something, especially a fissile material production treaty. In the peaceful uses, there was a call on the UN Secretary General and the IAEA Director General to jointly convene a high-level event on peaceful uses and sustainable development. That would have been good to have agreed by consensus. That doesn't mean, though, that it's entirely lost. I think some interested states parties would still be able to take those initiatives forward. And I think at least the United Kingdom said as much, that they would continue working on the sustained dialogue that they have launched with the United States on peaceful uses and sustainable development. So not everything is lost, but we don't have a consensus agreement reaffirming past commitments and taking forward at least some of them.
So going into the conference, one of the more controversial issues among states was the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, known as the TPNW, or the Ban Treaty, where some states, part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, see the Ban Treaty as useful and some see it as a distraction. So how did this conference, in your view, deal with issues around the Ban Treaty?
I'd say in our more innocent days, a number of us thought that the TPNW might become the major controversial issue at the next RevCon. That was not the case, I don't think. And it's in part because it's been overshadowed by other very serious problems, and in part because the states parties to the TPNW kind of made a very conscious decision that they're not going to make this the controversial topic. It really isn't their intention behind negotiating the treaty. They were going into the review conference determined to really focus on the past agreements of the review conferences of the NPT. That said, of course, they wanted the recognition that the treaty is in force and that they believe the treaty is complementary to the NPT and it's part of the non-proliferation disarmament regime. So they got some of that, right? We got a very neutral paragraph sort of acknowledging the fact that the treaty has entered into force and that it has this many states parties and signatories, that it has had a first meeting of states parties. What got dropped from the text in the final version is the reference to the outcomes of the first meeting of states parties, which produced an action plan and declaration. Was their attempt to get more language sort of welcoming the treaty, certainly, but again, it was not a centerpiece of the debates, even in the disarmament pillar.
Now, the Ukraine crisis has led to the suspension of talks to replace the New START treaty. And now the Ukraine crisis has contributed to the collapse of this NPT conference. In your view, how far does this go, right? Do you think we can make progress on arms control while the Ukraine war is still unfolding?
It's hard to see how we're going to make progress on arms control. I'll be honest, especially in the sense, in the meaning of arms control that we're used to, right? Legally binding treaties. It's hard to see an actual negotiation happening anytime soon and actually concluding a legally binding instrument between the United States and Russia. They might be able to other things short of negotiations on the treaty, especially in the area of risk reduction. It was seen as generally positive that the 5 nuclear weapon states issued a statement reaffirming that the nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And considering that Russia insists that they still are committed to that statement, it might be possible for US and Russia and others to work a bit more on nuclear risk reduction. But a number of states pointed out during the negotiations that having that statement on January 3 was great, but it was followed on by an invasion and issuance of threats to use nuclear weapons. So how much faith they have in that statement is debatable. But yeah, I haven't seen what's been going on and how it all went down in the final hours of the review conference. It's hard to see how we're going to have any real progress anytime soon.
And last question for you. Give us a sense of your mood and the mood of the other people in the conference on that late Friday afternoon, right, when the consensus in some ways unexpectedly collapsed. What was the mood as people were sort of filing out of the conference room? And given the failure to reach consensus, what do you see as next for the NPT?
The mood overall, I'd say, was deflated. Even given the complete lack of enthusiasm for the substance of disarmament, especially part of the document, I think states were still disappointed. And that actually gives me mixed feelings, because on the one hand, a lot of observers say it was to be expected that the conference would fail given the circumstances. And at the same time, we saw how seriously states parties approached the conference and preparations for the conference, how seriously they approached negotiations, and they really worked very hard to get to a final document. And so we had the situation where, in some ways, the outcome was predetermined before we started. And on the other hand, states parties, delegates, diplomats put so much work into it that we came close, it seemed, to having a result. And I think that's a testament to there still being so much faith in the regime and so much will to strengthen it, to keep it afloat. And so that gave me mixed feelings, because on the one hand, it was very disappointing. On the other hand, I thought if we came this close, despite the situation, it does show that states are committed to the NPT. That gives me some hope. On the other hand, it's the second in a row review conference that failed to adopt a final document. We don't see progress on disarmament. In some respects, we see a reversal of trends, such as the overall numbers of nuclear weapons, the continued modernization, the seeming reaffirmation of the role of nuclear weapons in national security. So it's hard to see what's next for the regime. It seems like we need to do quite a lot of soul searching and analysis in terms of what is the review process really doing for us. Can we go on running things in this way? And those questions have been asked before, but we might be in the worst crisis we've had since, I don't know, the 80s or even since the treaty has entered into force. So there's actually a decision that was adopted by states to establish a working group to look at the methods and the review process and how to make it better. I don't have very high hopes for this working group, or rather I don't have high hopes for the recommendations coming out of the working group to be adopted, but it's at least an opportunity to critically examine the process and try to find ways to make it better, to make the review process respond to the current time.
Gaukhar, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and best of luck in all your work.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billet, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Xing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.